Ember 3.11 was released a few days ago, and there's quite a few new features in it. And I thought it would be fun to take a look at one of these, which is the on modifier. And you can read about it right here on the release blog post. But the gist is that the on modifier gives us a straightforward way to listen to DOM events. Now in Ember, we already have a few different ways to handle actions. So I just kind of want to look at what action handling is going to look like now that we have the on helper. So to give this a spin, I have Ember Maps code base right here. And this is rendering locally the podcast page where we kind of have this video player here. And we also have these video controls. And these let you do things like change the speed and fast forward and rewind the video. Now this is a demo video because we're kind of running locally here, but the controls still work, we can see. And this is what we can use to kind of try this new modifier out. So right here, I'm kind of in our video hero component, which is what renders our videos on Ember Maps website. And this is made up of a few more components. And this bar right here with the video controls and this button that we want to look at today is in this playback controls component. So here's the template. And here we can see, the undo icon, the minus icon. Here we say normal or the playback rate if we change it. For instance, if we increase the speed. And so kind of here's this button right here in the interface, which right now is just increasing this playback rate. And, if we look at this element right now, we see that we're rendering this button tag and we have a few attributes that we are setting. We have some Tailwind classes here that we're using to style it. And then here we're using a closure action, passing it to this onClick attribute. And this is how we're wiring up the increased playback rate action. And if we pop open the component right here, this is a pretty typical looking Ember component. We inject kind of this service and this is what we call state. And this is what we use to just communicate between these various components and setting the playback rate and fast forwarding the video. And that's kind of a message bus that we use to communicate that state. So these actions are pretty simple. When we click on this button right here and we want to increase the playback rate, we just run this function and we just increase this state a little bit. So again, this is pretty standard. These are methods in the actions hash and we're using closure actions. Now, if you've been working with Ember, you know that these kind of closure actions right here using this action helper is a nice way to do event handling in Ember because, you can pass these things down. So if you were to render kind of some component here and you wanted to pass in like a handle change argument, you could just do it like this. These would be kind of a sub-expression right here. And that's kind of how you can pass around actions. And so when these closure actions were introduced, this was really handy. But here on these elements, you might also be familiar with the original action modifier, which was how we first did action handling in Ember. So that looks like this, where you just kind of write this action like this, and then you say increase playback rate, and then you close that off. So we wouldn't use on click, we would just do that. And if I save this, and we come back to the site and check it out, we'll see that, this button still works. Obviously, it's still updating the state. As we can see, this label is changing right here. And so this is kind of the second way to do action handling today in Ember. But, there's a lot of drawbacks with this, which is why over time we've migrated to using closure actions with these kind of on star attributes. So, this is too simplistic. This is better, but this method actually also has some drawbacks. And the big one is that, right here, we're just passing in this action to this on-click attribute. And just by the way kind of HTML and JavaScript work, this data right here is going to be reflected onto the element itself as an on-click property on the actual DOM element. And that's what's going to wire up the behavior. So this is kind of something that's a little confusing. Actually, a lot of the frameworks kind of have blurry lines between attributes and properties. And that's a big part of the motivation behind a lot of these changes in the upcoming Octane version of Ember. But long story short, this syntax right here, what the DOM is going to do with this is say, let's get the element, this button right here in the actual DOM. So it's something like get element by tag. And then it's going to set the on-click property. It's just a JavaScript property on this actual element. And then it will set that equal to our function, which is what will wire up the behavior. But the fact that the DOM does this for attributes, which are these things in our HTML templates, is kind of a coincidence and actually doesn't work for every element like you'd expect. You know, we have on click and we might have on mouse enter, but there's some events that this doesn't work for. So the other way to attach events kind of at a root level is with add event listener. So you've probably seen this before where you can call button.add event listener, click, and then run your function right here. And this kind of add event listener and remove event listener logic is a much more robust and clear way to add and remove events in JavaScript. And so because of some of these quirks here, this syntax here of passing in an attribute and having it reflected onto the property of the actual DOM element also has some drawbacks. So because kind of both of these have drawbacks here, that is some of the main motivation for this new syntax, this on syntax. And so what does this look like? Well, I've gone ahead and installed this this add-on, Ember on modifier, which implements the on modifier from the RFC, just because we're not on 3.11 in this app. This is a great add-on, and it has support all the way back to 2.18. So you can just install this, and you can just start using this kind of progressively, fully backwards compatible in your app today. So that's what we're doing here in Ember Maps codebase. So let's go back to what we had before with the closure action and the attribute here. And let's see how to use this helper. So I'll just comment that out. Now the modifier just exists in what we call element space. So we just say on, click, and then here's where we have our function. So let's make a new function here. We'll just call it some function. And you know, in Octane, we're starting to use this dot some function just so it's kind of more clear where this is coming from. It's not an argument or anything like that. If this was an argument, we'd use that sign, and that would tell us that it's coming from the parent component. But in this case, let's just make a new function called some function. And we can come over here, and this is just going to be in the very top of our component here, hello from some function, and we'll just do that. So if I save that and save this, we should see this all work. So now if I come down and click plus, there we go, we see hello from some function. And so this is kind of the basics of how this modifier works. You can see that we actually just pass the event name like this, like a string, and we're not setting this to a property or anything like that. It's actually just running in what we call element space. And this is basically, you can think of this like that JavaScript I wrote earlier. It's going to look something like get element by tag button, and then on is basically add event listener, and then click is basically the first argument, and then the function is the second argument. And so you can see already there's a very nice mapping here between what this code is doing and kind of the equivalent in just raw JavaScript. So this already is an improvement here. It's just more familiar to people who already are used to working with these web APIs. All right, so instead of using this some function here, let's come back and try to get our action working again. Now our increase playback rate function is on this actions hash. And you know, this is just referring to that component, our component class right here. So we actually can look that up using this .actions.increase playback rate, and this will be that function. So if we kind of do this and save this and see what happens, come down here and click plus, we'll see that this .get is not a function. And so this actually is invoking the code here in this action, but we're seeing that this .get is not a function. So it's trying to execute this code and it's not working. And that's because the this context isn't bound for us just by using this modifier. This modifier is literally just about calling add event listener here. So we still need to bind the this context. And so the way we can do that is still by using the closure action helper that we're used to using. So if we were to just throw this action helper right here and do this and come back and try out our button, we'll see that it works again. And that's because that's kind of always what this helper has done. It binds the context and it also curries along, you know, any arguments that we pass here, kind of just like always. But this is kind of how these work together. Now this is a little strange. We would usually not do this .actions. And so we could either move this increase playback rate action. We could actually go ahead and let's comment that out and bring it up here. like that. Save that, save that. Oh, and I think we hit an error here. An action named increase playback rate was not found. So that's usually when the action helper is trying to look up an action by string. And that's because we have a keyboard shortcut up here that we're wired up to the version that was on that hash. So I can just comment that out just so we can get this working. And now if we click this button, we see that it's working again. So I think the pattern going forward in kind of once Octane is ready is going to be to have our actions kind of on the root of our components. And we're also going to get an action decorator that we're going to be able to use right here like this. So we don't have to use that in the template. But, kind of right now, we can start getting the benefits of on, but still stick with some of the other patterns we have in this app. And, it's going to be a while before we kind of migrate everything over to Octane patterns. So we can go ahead and put this increase playback rate action right back alongside the rest of our actions here in the actions hash. And what I'm going to do is just use the kind of standard version here where we pass this as a string into the action helper. And that way we know we'll get a bound version of this action here, and we'll attach it using on to the click handler for the button. And so now if we come here and try this out, we'll see everything works. So that's pretty neat. Now something else that's pretty cool about on is that we can use it multiple times. So if I go ahead and move it out and we just kind of went back to what we had, on click equals action increase playback rate. We know this worked before, but we have this other function up here, some function. And if I wanted to invoke that as well when I click the button, if I were to try to do something like this, action this.some function, well, this is not going to work because there's only one on click attribute for each element, right? This is just going to override this the same way if you did, person.name equals Yehuda and then person.name equals Tom. Like this one's going to win. So there's only one way to do it here. So these don't really compose in that way. And you might think that this is kind of a silly example here, but imagine someone else had added an on-click handler, maybe from the component's JavaScript or in some other way, and it would be very easy to see how you could do this and just overwrite someone else's code here. So this is not really possible. And if I save this and we come look at the app and I click this button here, we see that some function is getting run, right? We see the console log here, but we're not changing that state anymore in the control bar. So nothing's happening. So if we go ahead and get rid of that and pull back down our on modifier here, well, we actually can layer these on top of each other. So this is just a function that's getting called in the same way that, we can kind of write add event listener, some function 1, and then in JavaScript, we could just call this again. This is just adding another event listener. We can do the same thing here. And so let's say on click, we want to go ahead and call this.some function. So if we save this and come back to our app and try this out, now we see some functions getting run and we are actually changing that state. So this is actually another huge benefit of using these modifiers. And of course we could put this, if I were going to actually add this function here, I would just follow the pattern that I already have and go ahead and move this to the actions hash alongside the other actions here. And that would all work as well. So the point being, we can use this multiple times. Let's go ahead and save that. And it works just fine. And this right here, click, so far we've just been using click, but we can pass any DOM event here. So mouse enter is a DOM event. So now if you want to add something on mouse enter, you do it the same way that you use, that you add the click listener. We just change that argument. And now we don't have to go and look up docs. Is it kind of is it on mouse enter equals, or if we're in a component, is it on mouse enter? None of that, right? These are just the literal names of the DOM events passed into a function, just like as if we were calling add event listener. And so again, this is pretty explicit. It's pretty nice. Come back to the app. Now when we hover on the button, our mouse enters it. We see some function is run. And when I click on this, we see the state changing. So that's kind of another really nice part of this as well. Now something else worth mentioning, let's come over to our some function method here, and let's go ahead and log the arguments. So we'll just log whatever arguments are being passed to this function right here when we mouse enter on the button. So we mouse enter, there we see hello from some function, and the arguments, the first argument is the mouse event. And so, this has the target and it has all of these variables. This is the DOM event for the event that was fired. And so now we have this event right here. And this has kind of been another quirk with the way actions have previously worked in Ember. If we were to use the closure actions version, on click equals action, that would give us the event. But if we used this version, action some function, we wouldn't get the event. We could pass in args like this, but the event we weren't able to get. And so again, that's just another quirk that's been smoothed out using this new syntax here. So this will give us the raw event, again, just like it would in JavaScript. If we were writing this right here in JavaScript, this would be a function and the first argument would be an event. So you can use that and get whatever you need to from that. And of course, because we're kind of composing action with on here, we can pass in new arguments. So we could pass in foo right here as an argument, save that. And back here, if we were to just look at the arguments just like before, go ahead and log those and come here and try this out. Now we see we have two arguments. The first one is foo and the second one is the event. So this is basically plugging that function off of the hash, binding to this context, and then currying foo as the first argument. And that whole function gets used as the handler for this, which goes ahead and passes the event as a second argument. So this would look like foo argument here and then the event argument second. And this is kind of how this has always worked in Ember with these action helper that lets us curry arguments. Now there's another feature in 3.11 you might have seen in the blog post here, which came right before the on modifier, which is the fn helper, which is for function. And so that's going to kind of take the place of this action helper here. But we'll talk about that in another video. And for now, I think it's good to understand kind of what role the on modifier is taking and how it composes with the existing primitives in Ember. Now, one thing you might have asked is, if I write JavaScript and I write add event listener like this and I have some function, I need to write remove event listener and make sure I remove that as well. And this can get tricky if you have multiple event listeners and you've had to remove them all. You might have some kind of imperative code on some more complex parts of your Ember apps that do that. And so the question is, well, we are calling on here. Do we need to call kind of off somewhere and make sure that that works? Well, the answer is no. That's all kind of taken care of for you by this modifier. And that's one really cool thing about these modifiers is that basically, we just get to run arbitrary code. And this modifier function that gets run gets access to the DOM element, the actual element in JavaScript, and it knows kind of when this element is rendered and when it is unrendered from the screen. And so that's why these modifiers are so cool and why something as simple as this little on modifier can wrap up so much of this logic for us. So we don't need to remember to tear down these listeners that are added with on. We also don't even need to remember to recall them if the arguments change. So let's say we did have an on click here, and instead of just calling increase playback rate, some local action, let's imagine that we were kind of making a reusable button component and someone passed in an on click action. And we just made this kind of an argument to our component. So someone could do button, my button, and then on click equals action increase playback rate. So, maybe the caller is able to do something like this. So if we were building this, we could do this. And even if this changes over time, this on click changes over time, if we were just writing JavaScript and we're writing add and remove listener ourselves, if this ever changed, we'd have to go ahead and remove the old one and add the new one again. But again, the modifier is going to take care of that for us. It's going to make sure that if any of these arguments change, everything's going to be up to date. Again, this is the power of kind of handlebars and just this declarative templating layer that's taken care of so much of this for us. So I'm really happy with how this API turned out. I think it's a really good way to attach event listeners to our elements, and it basically replaces kind of the old ways that we had, which were the action modifier. It really was a modifier, but we didn't really call it that because it was the only one in Ember, and that's been around since the early days of Ember, or these kinds of on-click attributes and the closure actions that get mapped to those properties. And so on is basically going to replace both of those. One last kind of cool point about all this, which is true of modifiers in general, is that they're really robust to server-side rendering. So when Ember is being rendered on the server, if you look at add event listener here, Events by definition are things that happen on the client. They happen because of a user event. But if we're pre-rendering our Ember app on the server, there is no user, there are no events. So that was always kind of something of a confusing point. If you look at something like onClick equals action handle click, right? Well, this is an attribute. And a lot of times attributes, we do want those rendered, right? HTML, this would be kind of the HTML payload. And the classes, we would definitely want those to be in the HTML payload so that when the browser first gets our app, it knows what classes are applied to this button. But if you think about this, there's no real semantics in HTML or the DOM to be able to take, this handle click action and serialize it into a string and maintain the context and somehow turn this into a string that's going to be kind of JavaScripty, but able to be server rendered and serialized for us. And so, there might be some rules that kind of strip this out because this doesn't really make sense to server render. But now with these modifiers, it's just crystal clear. We can look here and say, oh yeah, every HTML attribute, we want this to end up in our server rendered page, right? And these, we're just going to literally strip them out because they don't make sense to run. Modifiers don't make sense to run in a server environment, right? They're all about attaching behavior once the thing is rendered to the screen so that they can be interacted with. But in a server environment, we don't have that. And so this is just kind of removed here, and it just removes a lot of that ambiguity. It makes it crystal clear that this is just code that's going to get run on the client. So I think that's just, again, another really, really awesome point about the design of these things, and it makes it really easy to explain, especially to someone who's kind of newer to Ember and comes from a world where, they might be familiar with HTML and the DOM JavaScript APIs, but they don't know about kind of all this action stuff that we've had in Ember. So that's the basics of the on modifier. Again, you can go ahead and start using this in your app today using this really great add-on that polyfills it all the way back to 2.18. And I encourage you to give it a shot in your own apps today.